Muchísimas gracias a todos.
Thank you all for being part of this panel. With us are Bruno Westin, the Secretary of PPPs in Brazil, David Duarte, from the Ministry of Finance of Chile, Denise Arana, from the PPP unit of the Development Bank of Jamaica, Saleh Asvat from the National Secretariat for Infrastructure of Panama, and Rafael Luzgas from Proinversión Peru. So thank you all for being here today and for making the time to share your experiences with us. As you know, during our presentations today and tomorrow, we will be addressing critical topics for PPPs in the region, just like the development of innovative financing schemes and also development of projects in hospitals and water and sanitation projects, and the need to reinforce better competition and transparency standards. We will also be addressing the projects for preparation of specific projects and the development of mechanisms that will foster more inclusion and also gender perspective and citizen engagement in the development of PPPs. So I would like this opening session to be the starting point to encourage you to partake in our discussions for the next 2 days. We would like to hear from different countries and their experiences. This is why we have such a varied panel today. So I would like to start by asking Bruno.
I'm going to switch to English. We are facing a very challenging scenario when it comes to public sector resources to invest in infrastructure. What do you think are the main challenges and opportunities that Brazil is facing to mobilize private sector investment in economic and social infrastructure sectors?
Muito bem. Bom dia a todos. Obrigado, Gaston. Primeiro, gostaria de externar que é uma honra.
I am really happy to be taking part in this Congress on best practices in PPPs, and I would like to thank the IADB for their initiative. So what would be the opportunities? It would be really worth reinforcing that this is a fantastic instrument to promote investment in public infrastructure, including providing public services. You know, we have to remember that behind these contracts, which are long-term contracts, we need to always remember that we are looking for stability. And by stability, I mean all sorts of stability: geopolitical, macroeconomic, regulatory stability. This is very important. Brazil has a privileged position in all these matters, and it has created good opportunities to provide public services through the private sector. I'd like to underscore the issue of stability. As Vice President Ancor has said, we cannot just forsake fiscal stability in the project. So when we speak about macroeconomic stability, we must always remember that the most important thing to look after is economic stability, whether through private PPPs or through public investment alone. We need to look for stability in our projects, because if we look for stability, planning will be good in when we create our PPPs, we need to include and consider best practices. So we need to think of regulatory stability as well. PPPs tend to promote best practices so that we can build the best foundation for greater regulatory stability. When we speak of best practices, we always need to think of best practices in a country. So we need to assess the practices that we've learned from other countries and then localize them and import them. This is what we did in Brazil. There is always certain adjustments that need to be made to the laws and to the regulations so that we can bring in the best practices adapted to our countries. And Brazil has a very long story of PPPs that dates back to the 1990s. These concessions were rather shy at the beginning, and in fact, society and the community were resisting PPPs because they saw them as a way of privatization. But it was after a PPP unit was created in the federal government, which became our investment partnership program, that PPPs took off with several contracts. Several amendments were made to regulations as well and began fostering good practices both in the federal government and in the local governments. So now Brazil has a widely consolidated structure. We have a PPP unit, we have fiscal stability, we have regulatory stability as well. And this has been a good opportunity that has allowed for the success of Brazilian PPPs.
Muito obrigado, Bruno.
Well, thank you, Bruno. I would like to give the floor to David Duarte now.
Está retrasado en otra reunión, entonces creo que podríamos pasar a la
So David is in another meeting, so maybe we could just ask Denise and then Rafael.
Perfecto. Muchas gracias, Sancor.
Thank you, Ancor.
Denise, thank you for taking the place. Jamaica has made an impressive work by becoming a pioneer in terms of the inclusion and sustainability components in PPP process. What do you think are the main challenges ahead to operationalize this agenda and to develop a sustainable PPP project pipeline?
Morning and thanks, Gaston, for allowing me to share in this very important discussion. The PPP network is really exciting, and it gives us a chance to learn from each other. So your question is about the Jamaican program and sustainability and operationalizing our, I would like to call it our sustainability agenda. And I think I'll preface the discussions by saying that sustainability is very important to ensure that the objectives of the government through the service provision through PPPs, it has to be continuously maintained over the entire project life cycle. Okay, so it's very important for sustainability to be embedded in any PPP program, and that filters down to a sustainable PPP pipeline. I think when we thought about sustainability in the earlier days of PPPs, it was mostly centered around preserving natural resources and, environmental and social impacts. But sustainability today, the view takes a broader account of financial and economic viability, affordability, fiscal considerations, and even the capacity of the government to execute PPPs properly, right? So it's a broad range of elements that come together to form a sustainability, a sustainable pipeline and a sustainable program. So all are important elements. And the government of Jamaica has established clear policies and guidelines related to the development and assessment of PPPs and sustainable PPPs. In our policy, we have PPP criteria that clearly cover the gamut of what we're speaking about here. We look at project viability, and by project viability, we mean that we assess the financial, economic, the legal environment, social, and environmental issues. And we will soon be, thanks to the IDB, and I'll speak a little bit more about that, we'll also be incorporating the climate change and climate risk assessments in our entire process. So in addition to project viability, the Ministry of Finance, who is our counterpart PPP unit, also focuses on value for money and fiscal sustainability as well. So I think for the government of Jamaica's PPP program, we have covered the entire range of elements that will make a sustainable program happen. It's also important that this robust assessment process leads to incorporating sustainability elements in also the design of the project. So there's proper project preparation, and there's also project design. That said, I think I'd like to add one more element and just give you an example of the challenges that we have. And I'm going to use the recent publication of the toolkit for climate resilient PPPs, which was done by the IDB and the DBJ together, as an example of some of the challenges that we will have to face to ensure that our pipeline is sustainable and inclusive of the climate resilience considerations. One of the challenges that we will face, and I'm sure other countries will face it as well, is to get the buy-in of the general stakeholders when you're trying to introduce an additional element of sustainability in your program. And buy-in is very important, and you have to interact with all the stakeholders to ensure that you have a successful implementation. And where climate change is concerned, and climate risk in particular, it's a very heavy topic, and there has to be engagement and capacity building. And I think generally any kind of sustainability element that you're going to include in your program, you have to start by embedding it in policy. So all of the elements of sustainability have to be included in your policy and your processes to ensure that there is compliance. I think also that the capacity of the government to execute is very important. We have, as stated before, 2 centralized units that work together in Jamaica to manage the entire program. And I think, for example, with the climate change agenda and the social agenda, we also have to ensure that the capacity is there to undertake the necessary technical assessments. That might have to start with having Gaston external advisors, climate experts come in and have a transfer of knowledge over a period of time to the units and to government officials. And the last thing I'd like to say about challenges and how we're gonna overcome them is that when you introduce a new element to your program, and again, I'm using the climate change example, when you introduce a new element, there has to be a period of actual practical testing of that element with real live projects on the ground, which is one of the things that we're going to be doing where climate change is concerned. We are going to be looking at a pilot project or two with the help of the IDB to implement that toolkit and to identify any issues that are there in relation to practical application. So I think, Gaston, that's it from me. That's a mouthful, but those are the several elements that come together in our program to ensure a sustainable PPP pipeline.
Thank you very much, Denise. Sale, buenos días. Muchas gracias por unirte. Panamá ha hecho un gran
Thank you, Alex. Sale, Panama has done great work by strengthening the regulatory framework and developing a pipeline of sustainable PPPs. So what are the opportunities you would say in the social area to apply these mechanisms, and what would be your view for the next few years?
That's me, right, Gaston? So in terms of a very important aspect of our program is to promote like social inclusion in PPPs. And I think we can all agree that
Denise, I was asking Sale.
Oh, sorry about that.
No worries, we do the second round later. Adelante, Sale.
I can pass along my question to you. Gracias, Gastón. Bueno, como mencionaba, gracias.
Hemos perdido, Sale. No sé si se ha caído tu conexión. No sé si, Sale, ¿nos escuchas?
Sale, can you hear us? Sale, can you hear us?
Contigo, Rafael, si tú
estás, Rafael, are you there? If you're there, I would like to ask you to please take over and let us see what the problem with Sale is.
No sé si alguien más me escucha.
No, se escucha muy entrecortado, Sale.
So,
Rafael,
Sale, we're having problems with connection. So, if you can please take over while Sale reestablishes his connection. Thank you very much for coming back. And Peru has made a great effort to develop social infrastructure projects and PPPs in education and health. So we would like to hear from you what have been the main lessons learned that you can tell us about and that you can share with the network, and how can other countries learn from this investment opportunity? Well, first and foremost, I would like to thank Gaston and the IDB for the invitation. These are very valuable spaces. And I would like to say a few things. I think that overall social infrastructure projects like health and education usually have specific problem because there are some agents that are particularly sensitive, like doctors or the population. And the teachers. You know, these populations tend to be very involved in the management of a project, and they are particularly sensitive to the effects of the public service to be provided by the private partner. So it is indispensable to carry out workshops with the different sectors so that they can explain the nature and scope of the private participation in, or the private engagement in the project. So private partners are focused on maintaining the infrastructure, but they are not involved in providing educational services, or they are not, or in the case of hospitals, there are no private doctors. So they so that is the first recommendation. We need to be aware of how sensitive these projects can be. And the second recommendation is that we need to take into consideration the importance of sanitation in the properties that are going to be part of the PPP. So this is a part of a public responsibility in Peru, and from our in our experience, we see that if we do not look at cleaning up and improving the properties that are going to be used in the PPP, their problems may arise later. That is the second topic. And the third factor, the third relevant factor, is that one needs to have sound technical studies that allow us to measure the scope of the services and the level of the services that will be requested from the private partner, so that there will be a clarity regarding the scope of a project and what would be and to prevent any delays due to technical issues. And finally, and I think it is very important that the public entity, particularly in the case of private infrastructure, if we have been working for 20 years with PPPs, and at the beginning we had a lot of work with mining and with mining companies, but in the case of schools and hospitals, we don't have prior experience. So it is very important that the public entity responsible for the project has experience with them, and that they can actively contribute to developing private projects. So there will be substantial improvement in the project. So, and the last, and as regards the social component,
por parte de los inversionistas si se trata de un solo proyecto.
And then we see that to the extent that we can have pipeline of a project, then and a full picture of a project, then we will be able to develop a full project. So we need to find, so it is easier for them to become interested as investors when they see that there is a whole pipeline of projects.
Muchísimas gracias, Rafael. Muy interesante todo lo.
Thank you, Rafael. Everything that you've brought up is very interesting. And coming back to you, Sale, and sorry for the technological problems. Panama has begun a very ambitious project with you, and it has been developing institutional capacity simultaneously and a series of sustainable projects. So we wanted to ask you, and well, there are other sectors like transportation where you have had PPPs. You're looking at less traditional sectors like the social sector. So we wanted to hear from you. What is
Gracias,
your
Gastón.
view?
No sé si me escuchan ahora mejor.
Excelente.
Perfecto. Muchas gracias. Nuevamente, gracias por la invitación y la pregunta.
So well, thank you for
Lo
your
que estaba
invitation
mencionando
and your
anteriormente
question.
era, obviamente, la
And
clasificación de proyectos sociales la conocemos
of
con proyectos
course,
que tradicionalmente se ven como
we
temas hospitales, temas de
know
escuelas,
about
etcétera.
the
Cabe recalcar
projects,
que para nosotros la
and it
visión
is
social
worth
de todos los proyectos
mentioning
es
that
clave
the
para la
social
aprobación
vision
misma
for
de los
us
mismos
is the
y
social
nuestra cartera,
component
nuestro pipeline de
is
proyectos,
key
todos
to approve the
tienen
projects, and
ese
all the
ángulo
projects
social.
in our
Ahora, regresando a la
PPP
pregunta
portfolio have to
particular
look to the social
del
aspects.
portafolio, el
And
pipeline
going
posible
back
de temas sociales, yo
to
creo
the
que para
portfolio
nosotros era
that you
importante
were
empezar
referring to, for us, what is
con
more
estas
important
infraestructuras horizontales
is
que son más
to
tradicionales, que nosotros podamos obviamente generar una experiencia en tanto el diseño institucional como
and we
contratos,
need
como modelos
to
financieros.
create
Panamá tiene experiencia
experiences
en
with other
concesiones, ya tiene una ley
models,
de concesiones
and
desde el
Panama
89,
has experience
pero
with
en el marco
concessions. We
de
have
la
had
nueva
a
generación de
concessions
proyectos
law
PP
since the
no se
1989,
había
but
aventurado,
we
por decirlo
did
así, la
not,
estructuración de
we
este
had
tipo
not
de proyectos
ventured
complejos,
into
y es por eso que
complex
nos ubicamos en este camino,
PPP
pero sí
projects,
tenemos
and
interesantes proyectos
we
que
have
estamos
very
evaluando,
interesting projects
y
ahead,
lo diré como
and
pilotos, ¿no?
we are
Uno de los
still
temas
assessing
que es muy
them.
importante para Panamá es el reforzar
And one
las
important thing
instituciones
for Panama is that we need
de la
to
justicia, y
reinforce
dentro de las instituciones de justicia, si bien pudieran clasificarse no como el tradicional definición de proyecto social, vemos la oportunidad quizás de hacer la primera infraestructura vertical, ¿no? Y obviamente tomando esa experiencia, ¿no? de una instalación, de una infraestructura que pueda prestar servicios públicos
been
a todos los
working
panameños,
on
eso nos va a abrir la
looking
puerta
at
a obviamente
installing
trabajar posiblemente
infrastructures that
otros
will be
programas
able to
que tenemos en
provide
el radar, que es escuelas,
services
el mantenimiento
to
de
the
escuelas,
whole of the Panamanian
y un
population.
posible
And that, of
piloto
course, will help us open
de
to
una
other
área
projects like schools.
médica o de hospital, ¿no? Como saben, como en el resto de los países podemos hacer infraestructura y mantenimiento y no se prestan los servicios médicos per se. Pero queremos ir por partes, ¿no? Queremos ir por partes bajo este nuevo marco
We
jurídico.
are,
Ya hemos lanzado un
but
proyecto
we can
en
do this
precalificación después
step
de haber aprobado la ley de
by
reglamentación.
step.
Esperamos dos
We
proyectos
can
más
first
en
start,
infraestructura.
we need to approve
Y
first the
creo que
laws,
esperamos que
then
con el
the
apoyo del BID
projects,
podamos
and
obviamente
then
aventurarnos
we hope that we
en
can
esa
have
primera
the
infraestructura
support of the
vertical que nos va a dar la puerta, pienso
IADB
yo,
to start developing
a
vertical
aperturarnos a
infrastructures
otros
so that
proyectos
that will
sociales
open the
el
gateway
próximo año, ¿no?
for other
Ese
social
sería, yo
projects
diría que las
in
oportunidades que
the
hay,
future.
principalmente en infraestructura
So
horizontal, más de 5.000
there,
millones de dólares en inversión que
we are
podamos
looking
licitar
at
entre
investment
este
partners
y otro año.
for other horizontal infrastructure projects for
Muchísimas
this year and
gracias,
next year.
Sale.
And
Bruno, eu gostaria de passar para você. O Brasil tem feito esforço muito importante no desenvolvimento
I would like to say that Brazil has made a very important effort in developing projects with changes and modifying a project. So this effort has been quite successful, and I would like to ask you, what are the challenges that you see in the future in Brazil to bring in more investments and more financing mechanisms for PPPs?
Bem, Gastão, muito obrigado pela pergunta. De fato, nós estamos, como falei, nós passamos por uma transformação aqui da cultura como o Brasil contrata a sua infraestrutura e a provisão de serviços públicos.
Undergone a cultural transformation regarding the way in which Brazil hires its or contracts public investment. And we need to mention and refer to the very important support from the IADB by bringing good practices and the technical expertise and the support from the federal government. So what did we do to transform this and to change and to have a strong pipeline of projects? And we have very good partnership examples for national entities, and we find that one of the bottlenecks is that we don't have enough well-structured projects. And what we had and what we did from the beginning was to build, to organize a good amount of PMIs that the private sector came up with several proposals. And we found that a lot of those projects did not survive. So in 2017, with the support of the IADB, we made a good effort with the fund to try to tackle the problem of not having well-structured projects and try to tackle the problem of those projects that died out very quickly. We realized that there were some peculiarities in the project that caused their failure. There was a lack of infrastructure in the local entities to review the projects thoroughly, and we see that the projects were thought of as private sector projects alone and not as if they were going to be implemented in the public sector. So this is how the federal government brought in their expertise, and we also brought in the expertise of multilateral organizations that brought the external view. This increased the credibility of our projects and allowed us to pursue partnership with the private sector. So this is how we managed to establish a pipeline and to change the culture. However, there are some challenges still that need to be faced, such as scale. And there is a lack of infrastructure for scale. And when we think of operators, and maybe that is our biggest challenge in light of the huge portfolio we have now. And some sectors still are not competitive enough, and we don't have enough involvement from the private sector. So now we need to encourage the private sector to help us with our large project portfolio. And as regards sustainable investment, there are several initiatives for private bonds, but what is important? And we need to have governance and sustainability criteria in priority projects. And this is not only about selecting the portfolio, because when we select the projects that are going to be in the portfolio, we choose those that have been planned for in the public sector. So we have logistics, we have energy projects and other sorts of projects, but they need to be sustainable. By way of example, our grid. We are focusing now on renewable energies, and over 90% of our grid is powered by clean energies. And this is a very important criteria, and therefore we need to take these into consideration. So we have to have a full overview of these projects and then propose them as such with the PPPs.
So, for example, the toolkit developed with the decision maker together with the DBJ and the IDB. The sustainability concept goes beyond the climate dimension. Particularly, social sustainability is key to ensure the proper project development and impact. What can you tell us about the steps that Jamaica making in order to promote the dimensions related to social inclusion in PPP projects?
Thanks for that, Gaston. I think it's worthy to start this discussion by indicating, and it appears that other countries are experiencing the same kind of phenomenon. There is a shift in Jamaica from the economic infrastructure, PPPs, for example. We've done highways, roads, we've done ports, and we've done airports. And we are now seeing a shift in our portfolio towards social infrastructure PPPs. So we have numerous water and wastewater PPPs. We have solid waste management PPPs. We have correctional infrastructure, judicial infrastructure. So I'm happy that we're talking about social inclusion as the government of Jamaica's portfolio shifts towards social infrastructure. And socially inclusive PPPs are important to the government because we need to ensure that all stakeholders benefit equitably, benefit in the same way from PPPs. And more importantly, we need to ensure that no community or no group is disenfranchised throughout the PPP process. So our entire program in terms of social inclusion really hinges around several principles towards development and structuring socially inclusive PPPs. So one, we feel that all affected stakeholders must be identified, and there has to be a consultation process, and they must be given a voice to air concerns, and they must be aware of the project. And generally, the government strives for minimal displacement and disruption of livelihood as far as possible. And especially because of the shift in our program, we are also looking at ensuring that access to the services produced must be available to all stakeholders, all Jamaicans. And that has an affordability element to it. So we have to make sure of that. In our policy, we have certain stipulations to ensure that there is social impact assessments done. We work very closely. We have an integrated process with the public investment appraisal branch. And so concepts that come in to the public investment appraisal branch, they have information, they have to provide information on the stakeholders, the critical stakeholders to the project, and whether or not any consultations have been done. So at the concept level, there's a very kind of strategic sense check as to whether or not there will be any potential social issues that we'll have to deal with. However, when we get to the business case stage, the business case does a deep dive into social issues. And what we found, and I would say that the policy touches on it, but doesn't go into detail, but what each transaction approaches it in a different way, right? So there could be consultations with communities surrounding the asset. Sometimes there is a broader engagement to kind of sense check public sentiment towards the whole, inclusion of private participation and private capital. And for instance, there is a particular transaction now that is so sensitive socially that the Prime Minister has said that there has to be a separate governance structure. So he wants to set up a separate steering committee to ensure that the stakeholders are consulted in a manner that will ensure a successful progression of the transaction. There is an anticipation of disruption of livelihood, and so he wants to ensure that there is a very clear plan to get them back on track and to restore their ability to earn. So there are several ways that we look at it. An important element also is that there must be mitigation strategies. So it's not just about identifying the issues related to social impact, but for us to assess the project, you also have to indicate what are the mitigation strategies. If there is resettlement, I know with the highway projects that the agency, which is known as NROC, they have very clear guidelines in terms of settlement, in terms of relocation, in terms of compensation, to ensure that no stakeholder is disenfranchised by the process. There is another layer of, I would say, social assessment as well, beyond the project preparation process. When these transactions are ready to be implemented and they have to go to our regulatory agency for approvals, then the regulatory agency also applies another set of I would say, social safeguards. And so you have to do an environmental impact assessment. And before you do that, during that process, there has to be clear public consultations. When the EIA is finalized, there's also another set of public consultations that have to be held. So I think in the Jamaican program, there are several layers that ensure social inclusion. And the last thing I would want to say is that communication is necessary, and the communication has to continue throughout the process. So it's not that there is communication at the beginning of the process at the concept stage. There has to be continuous communication with the communities and the affected parties throughout the entire process to assure them that there are measures that will be put in place to ensure that they will have a level footing and they will not be excluded. So I think in terms of that, those are some of the measures that our government and our PPP program have in place to ensure that there is social inclusion, to ensure that there is widespread access to all of the benefits that inure and accrue from PPP projects.
Thank you very much, Denise. We know for our research last year that Anchor led that this is a key aspect, particularly on delivering on time the projects. More than 80% of the times overrun and cost overruns had to do with the social consultation or the lack of social consultation further down the line. So this is extremely important. Sometimes is not taken care of in the right time and then generates delay later on in the game. This is valid for PPPs and traditional public procurement. This is more an infrastructure issue rather than a PPP issue. Sale, quería pasar contigo.
Sale, I wanted to talk to you. And as you know, we will be talking about the best sustainability practices for the development of infrastructure and ancillary services, not only from the environmental perspective, but also involving the social aspects that have been referred to by Denise, and also the long-term fiscal sustainability of the projects, which is critical in our meeting. And we need to ensure that PPPs are prepared in a sustainable manner that allows accessing PPP. So we would like to hear what is your view in Panama. Well, as Denise said, many of the best practices in the region have been imported from other countries. And what we have done in Panama is that we were one of the last countries in the region to adopt a PPP law. So in a way, this allowed us to include sustainability from the beginning, even at the legal level. So what we were able to do is to take the lessons learned from the other countries, and we drew on their ideas, and we designed a sustainability framework, so to speak. So we have something very similar to what the UK did with their model, and what we've done in our regulations is to have a basic framework that was developed from some technical reports. So what we've done is replicate what is understood by sustainability in different parts of the world. So what is banking sustainability, social sustainability, infrastructure sustainability, fiscal sustainability? So that is one thing. And then on the other hand, we have also looked at other technical reports. So we've developed tools, and in Panama, we set up a floor, which means a minimum standard that has to be fulfilled. Instead of having best practices, we have this floor or the minimum requirement. As you know, we have been working with the IADB on how to improve and quantify our contingent liabilities risk. And as you've said, very well, Gaston, this is something that has to be assessed for any kind of work. So for me, sustainability means on how you sustain the project, how you carry out the project. It is not necessarily something that has to do with the PPPs per se, but a PPP project has to meet the same evaluation and assessment requirements as any other project that is done with public funds. And in our case, our Ministry of Finance has raised the bar for the quality of projects, and we will improve this. And as regards financial sustainability, sustainability has to do with how you are able not only to finance a project, and how, if you can, you have to include also climate issues as well. We need to analyze the climate change impacts for the projects, and we in our pipeline, we need to take that into consideration. We need to take into consideration our climate goals. You know, Panama is one of the few countries in the world that is carbon negative, so we need to do more. We are about to issue the request for proposals for a power transmission line, and we need our partners to have a carbon neutral certificate before we can partner with them. So in that way, we will ensure that the projects will be sustainable throughout.
Muchísimas gracias, Ale. No podría estar más de acuerdo como tú mencionaste.
Thank you, Ale. I could not agree more with you. Fiscal sustainability is just as important as social sustainability for infrastructure projects. We usually have a bias towards PPPs and demanding them to be more inclusive. And in fact, Gankar and myself wrote a blog entry regarding the lack of equality or fairness regarding inclusion with traditional public investments. And in fact, Ancor, and Tomás Cerebrisky, the chief economist of the infrastructure department, made a study that said that if Latin America has invested around 3% of the GDP in infrastructure projects, and 2/3 of that, so that means around 2% of the GDP has been invested in traditional public works, and they account for the largest cost. And they have been issuing debt in 1% of the GDP just because they have incurred higher costs than budgeted. So in the end, PPPs don't have these problems, or because the discussion is more complex, but there is a challenge in the use of public funding, and that needs to be considered. All the more in the light of our budget constraints. So this is why we need to make evidence-based policy decisions.
Rafael,
So,
pasar contigo,
Rafael,
con tu siguiente pregunta.
I wanted to ask you.
Deme un segundito. Uno de los principales retos actuales para el desarrollo de infraestructura en la región es garantizar el desarrollo sostenible.
So one of the things that we need to do in the region is to guarantee that the investments or that the projects will be sustainable. So in Peru, your experience shows that it has been important to look at the properties and involving the communities in the project. So can you tell us about consultation projects and citizen engagement in the case of Peru, and what is the role that you can play for to ensure sustainability? Well, thank you for your question, Gaston. Adding to what has been said before,
en el caso del Perú y los proyectos que llevamos a cabo en preinversión, se identifica de manera temprana a las comunidades y grupos de interés, y para esto incorporamos un módulo de gestión
we
social y
have
ambiental.
included an environmental and social management module in our agency. So we have environmental specialists, and they allow us to identify the risks and map possible problems, and so that we can have prior consultations with the indigenous communities. Prior consultation is mandatory for public services, and that did not exist before, but it is mandatory now. So we are working on mainstreaming the processes from early stages together with other entities, and they participate according to the legal scope they have. As I have said, it is important to make sure that the properties that are going to be used, or the land that is going to be used in the projects, are clear and free of any encumbrance to be used. And some of the lessons learned as a result of the lessons learned from other PPP projects, we have been working on clearing the title to the properties that are going to be used by the private partners. And then we have a couple of laws that have been amended and that establish that the PPPs will be authorized whenever they are ready. So the work needs
creo que estas son medidas que hemos ido
the work needs to be done to ensure that the properties are clear, that the titles are delivered to the partners, and we must be aware that we need to carry out consultation processes that are transparent, that are culturally adequate. This is critical so that any project will be supported by the stakeholders. It is impossible to talk about sustainability if you do not have a participatory process. I fully agree with Denise in what she said. Communication is critical, not only at the beginning of a process, but throughout the process. And during the execution of the contract, to ensure that whenever there is an expectation of a project, or if there are any delays, the stakeholders have to be informed whether their expectations are too high or if there will be delays as well. So, as has been said before, this is not only about PPPs. This is a topic that touches upon the development of public infrastructure and touches on private investments as well, and public investments as well, alone, without necessarily being a PPP. We see that with mining projects. So we need to identify problems at early stages, and we need to communicate those who are involved in the project from the beginning, during the execution, and until the completion of the project. Thank you. Thank you, Rafael. So we have exceeded our time by 3 minutes, and I would like to thank Denise, Bruno, Sale, and Rafael for being part. And thank you. I would like to invite you and your teams to join the rest of the Congress and to ask questions and to talk to the people at the IADB group if you think you need any support. I would like to thank you again, and Anchor, please. Thank you.